For this project, we are creating a Elements of Art and Principles of Design pamphlet. Your pamphlet will have 6 panels. Each panel or page will be dedicated to understanding and exploring a principle of design and an element of art. Here is my 6 panel pamphlet page. Here's another student example. As you can see, we've used the same silhouette of the ice cream cone or the paint palette and paintbrush over and over again to study each element and each principle. Let's go over the elements of art and the principles of design. Our elements of art are the building blocks used by artists to create a work of art. Essentially, if you don't have the elements, you do not have a work of art. The elements of art are line, shape, form, space, texture, value, and color. The principles of design are used in addition to the elements. So they help the principles or the design principles give structure and they help give a meaning to the piece. The principles of design are unity, balance, movement, emphasis, variety, pattern, and proportion. Because the principles of design are a little bit confusing, I want to go over them each individually. Let's go over the first principle of design, which is balance. Balance is the distribution of visual weight of objects, colors, textures, and space. So, in symmetrical balance, whatever we have on one side, we have exactly on the other. So, it feels symmetrically balanced. In asymmetrically balanced artworks, we have the sides or across from one another are different, but they still look and feel somewhat balanced. In radial balance, the elements or the pictures are arranged around a central point and they may look very similar. As you can see here, we have symmetrical balance. Here we have asymmetrical balance. And here we have radial balance. The next principle of design is variety. So, variety works with contrast, meaning that we want different things within our artwork. So, when an artist places different visual elements next to one another, he or she is using variety. So, for example, in this picture, we can see that the fork and the cup have a variety of different values and 2 colors, and also the feeling of being very, very different objects, creating variety. Here is a little bit different. We have a pattern that is in the back. And then the artist is creating or using variety when they're kind of distorting those patterns. The next principle of design is emphasis. And this one is a simple one. Emphasis is when we want the viewer or the artist wants the viewer to create a focal point or to look at something first. So that means we want the viewer to look at a certain center of interest first before they look around the rest of the photo or the drawing. You can see in both of these, the center of interest on the left or the focal point is going to be the eye, and then on the right is going to be the big orange head. This is when we emphasize those focal points. The next art principle is movement. When we create visual movement, we want our viewers to go from one part of the artwork to the other. And we're creating this sense by using curved lines, things that kind of intertwine between one another, etc. You can see visual movements throughout both of these works. Pattern is super simple. We know that patterns are repeated lines, shapes, designs, or colors. You can see that artists can use patterns in a variety of ways in order to create the sense of a pattern. Proportion is a tough one, but proportion refers to the size of the parts of an object in relation to other parts of that object. It emphasizes how big or small something is. So, for example, as you take a look at the proportionate face, you can see that the artist was using these guidelines to make sure that everything was in line with all of the other facial features. So, for example, the lips were half of the size of the eyes were the same size on both sides, etc. Sometimes artists use proportion to exaggerate things, so they'll make things seem larger than they actually are or smaller than they actually are. And unity is probably one of the most basic principles of designs. We do unity by just actually creating a pleasing work of art. So when we have unity, that means everything is in agreement with one another. It feels like everything just works together. So, with that being said, as I stated before, the panels are going to go one by one. Within each panel page, you are going to be creating a silhouette of your object. using that element and also combining a principle of your choice. So, the first element or first pamphlet page that we're going to be focusing on for our silhouette of our choice is line. Line is a path by a moving point. Lines can be expressive and they can control the viewer's eye and describe edges. It can indicate form as well as movement. Lines can also show value and texture. We use line for quite a bit. As you can see, there's different types of lines: straight, vertical, diagonal, zigzag, curly, chevron, spiral, etc. What you are going to think about is thinking about combining line and a principle of design. You can see here that artists constantly use line and a principle of design in order to create their artwork a little bit more, in order to make interesting artwork. So you can see here that towards the left, we have line and pattern. We also have line and movement in Vincent van Gogh's. We have line and variety, so a variety of different types of lines in Keith Haring's. And we also have line and balance in the bottom Mondrian. So, as I said, step one for page one of the pamphlet is to make a line silhouette. So, choose a basic silhouette of anything. It can be an object, an animal, a food item, a letter, anything that you want. Use only lines to illustrate your silhouette. Show a variety of different lines, such as diagonal, curly, wavy, zigzag, parallel, dashed, etc. While you are doing that, you are thinking about what principle of design you want to exhibit into your line silhouette. Make sure that on the back of each pamphlet page, you write the word line and the principle you chose. Remember, we are not choosing Unity as a principle of design for this project because Unity is so basic and so simple that every single one should have Unity in it. As you can see towards the picture of the far right, I created my silhouette, which was a paintbrush and a paint palette. I used lines and pattern. On page number 2, you are going to be focusing on the element of art, which is color. The element of art or color was invented by Sir Isaac Newton, and the color wheel was something that he came up with. The color wheel is broken up into color families. There are color families such as primary, secondary, tertiary. There are warm and cool color families. There are tints and shades. If we take a look at the color wheel that's on the right, you'll see that we have primary colors, secondary colors, and tertiary colors. Primary colors are going to be yellow, red, and blue. Those are the colors that we use to mix the secondary colors. The secondary colors are orange, violet, and green. So when I mix together yellow and red, I create orange. When I mix together red and blue, I create purple. And when I mix together blue and yellow, I create green. Besides the primary and secondary colors, there are colors called tertiary colors. And these are the colors that are essentially in between the primary and secondary colors. So these are colors like yellow orange, red violet, red orange. So we're using 3 separate colors to combine and creating them. Another type of color family, as I stated before, are warm and cool colors. Warm colors are the colors that remind us of things that are warm, like fire. So those are like reds, pinks, yellows, and oranges, whereas cool colors remind us of things that are cold, like blues, violets, and greens. Another type of color family is tints and shades. So when you have a color such as red and you add white to it, it becomes lighter, which is also a tint of red. When you have the color red and then you add black to it, it becomes a shade of red. And you can do that with any color. Another color family is complementary colors. So these colors are across from each other on the color wheel. So if you take a look at the color yellow on this color wheel, directly across from it is purple. So therefore, yellow and purple are complementary. That means that when they are placed next to each other, they look the most vibrant. Analogous colors are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So that is orange, red orange, and almost yellow orange. These are color schemes that really work well together. Another one would be blue, green, and then yellow green because they're next to each other on the color wheel. When you are thinking about your next part of your art project, you're going to be thinking about taking color and adding a principle of design to it. So as you can see here, we have the principle of design is emphasis, right? And we are using color to create emphasis in this work of art. Another principle of design that we're using is color and variety in this next artwork. And we also are using color and movement in the next one. For your next work of art, you are going to be choosing a color scheme using your silhouette. You must showcase at least one of the following color families: warm colors, cool colors, analogous colors, complementary colors, monochromatic colors such as tints and shades, primary colors, and secondary colors. You also must include one principle of design to exhibit in your silhouette with color. As you can see on the right hand side of the screen, we have my silhouette of my paint palette and my paintbrush. And I also use different color families within the paint palette. And I also use different color families in the background as well. I use tints and shades in order to create emphasis. Our next element of art for our next panel is going to be shape. So all shapes are two-dimensional, meaning that they only have a length and a width. They are flat. There are two different types of shapes: geometric shapes and organic shapes. Geometric shapes are these regular shapes that we recognize in math, such as circles, triangles, squares, rectangles, ovals. Organic shapes are those free form natural shapes that we notice but we don't have a name for. The other element for this one that we're going to be focusing on is form. So this page is a little bit different than the rest because we're actually combining two elements and one principle. So the element of art you're going to be also focusing on is form. So I want you to remember the saying shapes are flat and forms are fat. Essentially, in terms of art, form refers to the objects that are three-dimensional or have length, width, and height. Okay, we want to make sure that we remember that 2D is flat, 3D is form. There's two types of forms. There's something called actual form and implied form. Actual form is like sculptures or things that are three-dimensional. Implied form are just drawings that look three-dimensional, but they're actually flat. You can see these two differences on the bottom screen. You're going to be thinking about shape and a principle of design, along with form and a principle of design. And as you can see here, it's definitely doable. So I'm going to go through what I did for my panel here. When I was thinking about my silhouette, which is the paint palette and the paintbrush, I decided to break it up into two separate pieces. So the paintbrush I made completely flat out of shapes. I used circles, triangles, and two rectangles to create the overall shape, flat shape of the paintbrush. After that, I went over to the paint palette and I broke it up into form. So I wanted to make it look three-dimensional by creating an implied version of a three-dimensional palette. And then I did actual form with the paint splotches on each of or in the paint palette. And I used model magic to do that. So I create actual form. After I did that, I looked at my paper and I said, let me pick a principle. And I chose variety and I put a variety of different shapes and forms in the background of my drawing. The next page of your artwork is going to be texture. Texture refers to the surface quality of a work, the way things look like they feel. So describing words to describe texture are rough, smooth, silky, shiny, fuzzy, hairy, rocky, etc. Okay. When we have something called implied texture, that means that we are having texture that looks like it is furry, but in reality, we're just using drawings, right? You can see up on the top, we have drawings that are texturized, but we know that if we actually touch them, they just feel like paper. But then you have another thing called actual texture, and that is when we actually can feel and see the texture of an object. We are going to be combining texture with a principle of design. So you can see here that we have texture and balance, texture and variety, and texture and pattern. So remember, you are going to create texture in your panel by using different materials. You can use tissue paper, you can use newspaper, you can use magazines, tin foil, rope, yarn, etc. All right. We are allowed to use all of these materials in class, and you can also use any materials that you have at home. You are going to create your artwork showing texture, both implied and actual, and you are going to make sure that you are also using a principle of design. So for mine, I decided to mess with the proportions and I made my paintbrush really large and my paint palette really small. I put implied texture on the wooden handle of the paintbrush and also the metal handle of the paintbrush. And I put actual texture on the paintbrush head, the paint palette, and also the paint splotches on the palette, in addition to making actual texture on the background. The next element of art that we're going to be focusing on for the next part of our panel is going to be value. Value defines how light or dark a given area or hue can be. Values are best understood when visualized as a scale or a gradient from dark to light. So when you have something that's really dark and then you gradually go to light, you are creating value. Value is essentially what we like to call a shading. You can see here there are different value scales. There's also different ways to add value. We have something called hatching, cross hatching, stippling, scribbling, and blending. Essentially, when you are hatching, cross hatching, stippling, or scribbling, you are using either lines or dots or scribbles to create darker areas by going over and over again. The lighter areas, you're just going to make sure that you do very lightly and you're not doing as many lines, dots, or scribbles. You can see how we have different types of value techniques here. You are going to be thinking about how to create value with a principle of design. So you have value and movement, value and emphasis, value and proportion. And now you are going to do that same thing in your artwork. Remember, pick a principle of design that you haven't chosen yet. You're going to turn your 2D silhouette into a 3D form by shading with either a pencil, charcoal pencil, a fine point Sharpie, or a colored pencil. You're going to show medium, light, and dark tones in your work, and you're going to incorporate a principle of design. The final element of art we're going to be focusing on is space, and that is going to be in your last panel. So, in terms of art, space is the area above, around, or within an object. There are two ways to show space. You can do positive and negative space. So, the positive space of these two images, black and white images on the top, is the actual space that the object takes up, where the negative space is the space around that object. If you are someone who has not used balance yet, this is a great way to show space and balance. Also, if you don't want to do positive and negative space, you can create the illusion of space on a flat surface. So that means you can use things like the words foreground, middle ground, and background. In order to create the illusion of space, you have to do a few things. You can overlap, you can shade, you can place objects in a certain way to create this sense of space. Can use size, you can use value and focus, and you can use one point perspective. As you can see here, we have a few artists who use space and a principle of design, and you will be doing the same thing. So, showcase your silhouette by either doing a background, middle ground, and foreground where overlapping is the key, or use positive and negative space. Make sure to incorporate one principle of design in your silhouette. Here is a little pamphlet page that, or I'm sorry, a little page of my presentation that you can use to reference as you are creating your pamphlet. You can see that every booklet page has to have an element plus a principle. The principles are on the right hand side. You can only use those 6, and you are only allowed to use them once. Okay. After you're finished, post a picture of your artwork on Google Classroom. You do not need to fill out a rubric, and make sure that you write the element and the principle on the back of each pamphlet page.